Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel, Hyphens Classics. Today, part 3 of the gearbox rebuild. We're going to look at the front drive. And if we've got time, we're going to chuck in the transfer box and put that gearbox together as well. So we've got one complete unit. Going back to the teaser from the last episode, last Land Rover episode, we had a look at this car behind us. Well, we saw a little bit. It's a Panda 4x4, it's having some work done on it. And what we'll do in a future episode, we'll tell you a little bit more about the car, what we're doing to it, and the adventures it's going to go on. Right. Let's get into that front drive now. Going to the first image straight away. What I've done here, this is an image you've seen before, but again, just a reminder that what I've used an old spanner. You can use any metal bar, just a nut, any old bolt nut that will fit through, and this is just to hold the front drive, forward drive still as you undo the main nut there. Looking just above the old spanner, you can see the shafts for your permanent four-wheel drive in reverse and also the high-low ratio. And in moving to the next image, you can see that this little rocker arm that sits in the middle of this is the one thing that stops you from running permanent four-wheel drive in high ratio. All it's doing is between the two rods, selector rods, one's being held in while the other one's out. And then when you force that one back, this other one is then allowed to go out. So when you first go into low ratio, the other one doesn't ping straight out. It is in a spring, but that's when you reach down in the driver's well and grab the little ring and pull it up, it undoes a little locking arm that then allows that to push out. And you'll see later on in the video, there's quite a decent sized spring on the back of that shaft that pushes everything forward and moves the dog gear into place. While we're talking about the front drive, we're going to have a look at the transfer box because obviously there's a lot going on between the two components. We won't go completely into the transfer box at the moment. I think we'll probably have enough content for this video just in talking about the front drive, but we will go in and talk a lot more about things, the whole rebuild of the transfer box in the next episode. Slowly taking bits out of the transfer box and looking to clean it up. I'm looking now just in the top of the transfer box. So this is where the oil filler cap is, and you can look down, you can see the two selector shafts. On the top of the image at the moment is the selector shaft for high-low ratio with the select fork attached, and then you can see this quite decent spring. It's quite a long spring, and that's sitting on the high-low, that's the four-wheel drive lockout. In this next image, which I've shown before, we can see the little stamps on the two forward drive housings. And this again, we've talking to viewers and other like, what we think this is very much is that as an engineer in Land Rover would have received these back for rebuild, they would have stamped the components so that when because they would have probably had a whole bunch of these things on the workshop. So at least when they put the gearbox back together, they would know which components belong to which. And so the mating surfaces should hopefully still be the same. As you can see, there's quite a lot of gunk on this, which again took a while to clean off, but no different to the gearbox, which we've already talked about. As you can see here now, we've pulled the front drive off the transfer box, and the long shaft you're seeing there, that is the selector shaft for the high-low ratio. Other locking mechanism has already been taken out, and we'll see pictures of that a little bit later on. Here now I've taken all of the main shaft out of the transfer box and all the bits and pieces out. So this is the transfer case here. Again, we'll go into this a little bit later because there's quite a lot of detail that I need to talk you through around taking this shaft out. Because when you first look at it, you kind of sit there scratching your head going, how on earth did they get this in here? And it's a bit of a task, but it is possible. Definitely need a few heavy persuasion devices when you're doing it. Now we have the front drive out. We're now looking back in through at the clutch mechanism, the freewheel clutch. You can see here the selector arm that pushes the dog gear into place, and you can see the selector forks just sitting there up underneath there, pulling into the gear. Now we've pulled the four-wheel drive selector out and the selector gear. What we can still see, the clutch is still in place, and there's the house. This is just in the main part of the housing. What we'll notice later on as well as we go through these images, you'll find that while there are two components to this front drive, all of it is in this first section here. Pretty much everything that goes on with the front drive is sitting in this first housing. This is the clutch and the selector fork just out on the bench after a nice bit of a cleanup. Going back to this is the front housing. Now what this is here is there's a little in your high-low ratio, you've obviously got little detents in the shaft, and there's this little ball and spring that goes in here which helps you know roughly where it is. Well, that rolls and sits in there. This one, as you can see, got quite a lot of dirt in it. You can just look inside, you can see it's quite gritty and looks quite dirty. So I don't quite know, obviously I don't know if anyone had serviced this much, but yeah, had to have a good clean in there. And I'll show you, there's an image later of the shaft, and you can see that this is one shaft out of the whole gearbox that got quite a lot of dirt on it over time. And obviously with moving this backwards and forwards, it's basically slowly worn lines into the shaft. So turning that front housing around the other way, you can see now all the shafts are out. You can see the two holes for the selector shaft, and then that little arm, that's the locking mechanism that holds your four-wheel drive arm back in place when it's not being used. I've pulled out the old oil seals, and again, this is something with the two selector shafts in the early Land Rovers. Obviously they were open to the elements, and these are facing forwards, and so all the dirt and muck is coming up and it lands on these. And it's for me, having seen this now, this is one thing. If you own one, you definitely want to get in there and clean that up on a regular basis, because this is where all the dirt collects, and it goes, and it can after a while work its way inside. Now there's not a lot inside there per se, but there is going to be oil floating around there, and then that, if it gets into the oil, it's going to go back up through the bearing into the clutch compartment and get right all the way back. In the later gearboxes in the front drive, they ended up putting a cap over it, and it was held in place. Although I do believe if you do take your Land Rover, in quite wet areas and deep in mud, you're still going to get mud that then sits inside there. So while they tried to fix the problem by putting a cover on it, they almost made it worse, because then mud would get inside it, and then you wouldn't see it and you'd think everything would be fine. So don't know much later than what they did in the Defenders, but yeah, that was just some of those little things to think about. So we've cleaned up that front casing now. I haven't shown you the inside of that, but I do have an image a little bit later on, and I'll show you what it looks like, and just show you again that there's really not much in it. But here now we're looking at the main casing. This is once that front piece is off. As you can see, this is just the forward drive shaft that's coming out. Nothing much else to see there, except so that main bearing in there, we will talk about that. So in this next image, this is the circlip that's holding it in place. There's a few of these circlips through the gearbox. You've got to have a good set of tools to get these in and out. Here's the clutch. We have the clutch out now. At the moment, this still has the drive gear is still sitting in place in there. We'll pop that one out. There it is there, out. It's just sitting on the transfer case. And now we're looking into the clutch. Again, we've seen this image before. If we take a little bit of time here, you can see, and what I'll do is I'll point them out. You can see there's 3 components around the shaft. And in each one, you have a little spring going to another piece of metal. And then you've got 3 rollers, a bigger one, the biggest one, a medium-sized one, then a small one. And obviously, as it revolves around this way, things freely wheel and the drive doesn't happen. But as it goes back the other way, this little spring component is trying to push those little cylinders, I guess you'd call them, into as far in as they can, and they just jam up on the outside of the mechanism, which is attached to that shaft. It's all one piece of that shaft in front. And so from that internal spline of four arms, you can see, you get that turning mechanism, that then grabs onto the clutch on the outside and drives the front wheels. And of course, as I said, when you go backwards, they don't grab, or if you're just freewheeling down the road. So that's how the clutch works. In this image, I decided that I hadn't talked about any of the studs that come in right all over the gearbox. And as you'll notice, when you take these out, obviously the thread that goes into the aluminium is a much coarser thread. For obvious reasons, aluminium's a fairly soft metal, so if you had quite a thin thread and you tried to tighten that up, you could quite easily strip out the aluminium and everything will fall apart. So I did remove all the studs and clean them up, check them out, make sure they were good. Any problems within them, they would have been replaced. If you are going to go down this road and take these out, just remember that some of them come in different sizes. Even on one surface or one component, you will get different sizes based on what's the housing that's going onto it and what other things may fit onto that stud. Just looking at the main housing there, again quite filthy. Using lots and lots of cleaning products to get rid of mainly oil and dirt is pretty much what it was, and then clean that up with a nice wire wool at the end of it. Here's just a close-up of the bearing in that shaft, in that housing, and then what we do is we move into the next image So this is what I promised you. This is looking in the front housing. And again, showing you that really that's pretty much it, just the bearing. Obviously the oil seals go in the front of it, but inside there's pretty much nothing in there. We've done all the cleaning. I'm not going to show you images of that, mainly because I don't have any, but nothing really exciting about someone cleaning, I don't think. But here in this image now we've got all of the bits and pieces on the bench. So we'll talk about a couple of things. So I did replace the large spring that's sitting on the locking drive. Sorry, I'm not sure if you can hear it, but it's quite windy up here at the moment. The other thing is the bearing that's sitting on top of the main housing there. This was an interesting one. So for the most part, when I was buying bearings, for most of the Land Rover Series specialists, I could get the bearings I needed. This one, I couldn't find anyone anywhere. So what it is, I just did a search for bearing companies and found one literally just down the road. Hidden, it's not in a commercial estate, it's literally in the middle of houses. It may have been an old dairy or something, I don't know. But so I popped in there, this was on a Friday, probably Friday about lunchtime, just after lunchtime I think it was. Showed them the bearing. It literally had, I think, 2 letters and 2 numbers on it, and that was it on the whole thing. And maybe England, I think it may have been, and there was nothing else on it. They had a quick look and they said, yep, we've got something. Paid them some money, thinking this is going to take a couple of weeks to come in. Again, this was Friday. Monday morning at about 8:30, 9 o'clock, I got this phone call saying, oh, your bearing's here. And this thing had come from Austria. So, wow, what a service. And that was Newbury Transmissions and Bearings was the company I used. So, brilliant service and absolutely perfect fit. So you can see all the rest of the parts have been cleaned up. One thing we did mention before that I will again show you a picture a little bit later on was again some of the damage on the shaft that I did take to an engineering shop, but they decided because it was hardened steel that there wasn't really much they could do. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is again just showing a couple of the studs. This is on the back of the transfer case, and again being very, very careful because they are different shapes and sizes depending on and they could look the same size, like length, but if you look at the threads they're slightly different, and you don't want to be getting those wrong. So make sure if you're going to pull them out, make sure you know where they come from. Okay, transfer case, we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Again, not too much. I'm not going to talk too much about how I get everything in and out, but just know that obviously it was a bit of a mess. This red stuff, I've mentioned it before in the gearbox. I think when I was talking about taking the transfer box apart and the gearbox apart, this red gunk that someone had used, whether it's a gasket maker or sealer or something, I don't know, but pretty much found this red stuff everywhere in the transfer box and the gearbox and the front drive and everywhere. So if you're going to use those sorts of products, please make sure that you're quite careful about not getting it too close to the inside. Outside, probably not so bad, you can wipe that off. Put it on the inside, it's going to get in, it could get in and cause problems in your gearbox. So just looking at the back side of the transfer box, everything's off now. And look, magically it's clean. Look at that. If only it happened quickly when I actually had to do it. So looking at both sides, one other thing we'll talk about here in this image, you can see this is the mounting on the far side of the vehicle, and just above it is the little oil check hole and bung. Now this was moved at a later date, and there is a maintenance schedule bulletin that came out where you can move this, and I ummed and ahed about doing this and ended up deciding not to do it. I talked to a number of other people who just go, it doesn't really matter, it's not a big deal. The reason it was moved is because the gap, I think, between the chassis and there is like about this big, so it's quite hard to get your hand in, it's quite hard to actually see anything, but it is workable. But the bulletin basically says, and in this next I'm going to show you, that it gives you a measurement from that side of the transfer box in, and then up from the bottom, and you had to drill a hole, obviously tap in a thread and then put another bung in. But again, I decided not to. Moving along, got all the bits and pieces cleaned up. New bearings coming in, we've put all the new bearings in. Here in the transfer box, the main output shaft is in with your high-low ratio gears in place there. Again, we'll talk about that later. Flipping it over, what we can see here is the worm gear for the speedo cable. But this housing and everything else here is got quite another more important feature, and this is how you set up your end float on the main shaft. And it's quite a bit of fun. In the images here now you can see there's a whole bunch of shims you can get that sit over this, and then you get the literally the housing. I think it is called the speedo cable housing that goes on. So we'll talk about this in the transfer box episode because it is a bit long and involved. But basically, obviously, you have to go around putting a number of shims in, putting this on, checking your inflow, which involves weights and a piece of string or rope and a whole bunch of things like that, and measurements. And anyway, we'll get into that later. So once we've got that all on and all sealed up, then we're going to start putting the front drive back together. And yeah, let's have a look. So here is the new spring. That's all still probably wrapped up in that nice beautiful bag. New bushes as well, put some new bushes in there, and cleaned up all of the rest of the components. We've got the image here again of all of the parts for the front drive. In the bottom of the shot there in the foreground, we've got this is the arm and all the mechanism involved in the locking of the four-wheel drive. The shaft for high-low ratio is just off picture to the left. We've got the selector gear on the right there, and all the housings and bearings sitting there. Shafts are in place. The selector for high-low ratio has gone in. The spring and the initial arms for the locking part of the four-wheel drive and now these were a little bit of fun from memory of doing this. These were a bit of fun to put in because that spring is quite strong, as you understand. It's got to move that gear into place. And I do remember having taking a little bit of time over this one and pushing it in, and as I said, it's quite a strong spring, so I can't remember the exact details, but just be wary when you're doing that. We've got the transfer components in place. Now what we've got to do is put together the front drive itself. And in this first image, this is that bearing that I said I had to go and find. We're just knocking that in place, put the circlip in to make sure it's all good, push in the clutch mechanism, get the dog gear in place and the selector forks, and here, moving straight along, we've now pretty much got that front drive housing all together. And what we're going to do now is, first thing is, before putting the end cap on, what we're going to do is put that onto the transfer box. There weren't too many difficulties putting this together, this part. It really was just the springs and for the locking side in the transfer box that was a bit of fun. This was quite a simple thing. But the bearings here weren't fantastically tight, so you don't need a massive press for this. You can, if you're just careful, just knock it out. And there's good access around there to get the bits and pieces out, so that was all fine. Now, this is another bit of an interesting story. When I was putting this together, I had this question to a number of people, and you're always going to get a different answer, and I'm sure if any of you would like to put your comments below on this one, I'm sure we'll get some different answers. I did buy a full proper paper gasket kit for this, as I kind of thought that was the right way to go. However, there was that question, do I use a silicone sealant or do I do just traditional old school? I had the paper gaskets. These gaskets here were all pre-cut. I also bought some paper just gasket material in case I wanted to make one up, but I wasn't really sure or confident in just rubbing grease on it and putting it together, or just putting the gasket in by itself and leaving it. And of course didn't have the experience or the knowledge of what was the right thing to do. So when I first did this, and some of you may laugh, I can now that I've done it and I look back, but the first time I did it, I actually used some silicone, a little bead of silicone, then I put this paper gasket on, then I used another bead of silicone on the other side, and then put the housing in place. So the front drive has been put together that way. As I moved on to the other components, I gave up on the silicone and was just using grease on the paper gasket and have sealed things up in that way. So pretty much the rest of the car, the diffs, the rest of the gearbox, the transfer box, and the rest of that was built in that way. But that's how I started it. Anyway, again, I'd love to hear your comments about how you do things and what you think is right and wrong, and any experience you've had, like if you've done something one way and you've seen what happens over the years, what it looks like. It'd be really good to hear how you found that. Moving along, because this video's starting to get a bit long now, that front main part's in place, all of the selective gears are in place. I've just done another photo quickly here, just looking down. This is on the top of the transfer box where you fill the transfer box with oil. Then again, just so you can see all the gears in place, the high-low ratio in place, and the selector fork. Just making sure everything's moving nicely. As I put this together, always double check things are still, nothing's caught, because you don't want to put the whole thing together and then find something's not working. So another shot just showing this up on the bench. Everything's ready to go for the front. And here we have, in this position, I have a close-up image of that high-low ratio selector arm. And you can see here what I was talking about earlier, we talked about a little while back in this video. You can see some of the damage. So just to see round the edge of it, and this is pretty much where the oil seal sits. So I imagine this car has sat quite a lot in high ratio, because this is where I imagine with all the slight vibrations, and as all the dirt's got up on that oil seal and sat around there, you can see this is just like a nice little circular piece where it's been worn away a little bit. And I said I did take this to an engineering shop and asked them, is there something I could do with it? They went out back, tested it, and came back and said it's hardened steel. They didn't really want to do anything with it. I have ended up putting it back in as is. I ummed and ahed about this a lot because I wasn't sure. But when you look at the front housing, there's really nothing much in there. There will get oil in there, but there's not much spinning that really is going to get a lot of oil flicked up. And so I've gone with the fact that with the new oil seal in place, hopefully a little tighter, it should be okay. And we'll monitor that over time, and as this car does get driven, we'll keep coming back and having a look at that and see if we are seeing oil seeping out of there or not. So you can't quite see in this image, and I'll see if I can find a better one, but also where the bearing would roll up and down between those the three little divots, there's also a slight line. Like I said, that had got a lot of dirt in it. Here's the front housing, all nice and clean. We've got the gasket in place, nice new bearing in there, everything's all clean and tidy, and there it is now on. This is pretty much now wrapping up the front drive, just showing you the last images of the front drive all in place. Just again showing you, looking underneath the transfer box, that the gears are in place, everything's nice and clean and tidy. And that is pretty much where we're going to wrap up this video today. Like I always say, if you've got any comments about what you've seen here today, if you've got any comments about or questions about your gearbox, if you're taking yours apart and you've got any questions, please put them down below. I'll certainly try and help. Like I said, I'm not a mechanic, but having done this before, I certainly have now seen quite a lot. This is very much the early gearbox, so I haven't seen the later gearbox front drive, but if anyone's got one and they want to take it apart, then I'd love to see it. Or if you've got an old one that's just sitting around, you could always send it to me. I'll put my email address, or you can put something in the comments below. Otherwise, if you did like it, press the thumbs up, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks very much for watching.